One woman convinced America's most powerful banks to hand her $20 million, not through elaborate heists or computer hacking, through pure, audacious lies that exploited the greed of men who thought they knew better. Elizabeth Bigley was born dirt poor in a Canadian farmhouse. She died as Cassie Chadwick in federal prison, having orchestrated the largest banking fraud in American history. Between those 2 points, she convinced J.P. Morgan's associates she was Andrew Carnegie's secret daughter. She lived in mansions worth millions. She threw parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But what nobody knows is how she identified the fatal weakness in America's banking system, a weakness so obvious, so human, that it's still being exploited today. The secret wasn't forged documents or fake identities. The secret was understanding exactly what wealthy men wanted to believe about themselves. $20 million in 1904 equals roughly $700 million today. That's more than most Fortune 500 companies were worth at the time. She extracted this money not from one bank, but from dozens, convincing each that they alone held the key to unimaginable Carnegie family wealth. This is the story of Elizabeth Bigley, who became Cassie Chadwick, who became the most successful con artist in American history by doing something impossibly simple. She made powerful men feel smart while they handed her their money. By 1904, Cassie Chadwick owned 3 mansions, employed 17 servants, and threw dinner parties that cost more than a factory worker's annual salary. Newspaper headlines called her the Carnegie Heiress. Bank presidents competed for her business. Society matrons begged for invitations to her soirees. But 15 years earlier, she'd been Elizabeth Bigley, serving time in Toledo's county jail for petty fraud and prostitution charges. She owned nothing except the dress on her back and a sharp understanding of human weakness that would make her rich beyond imagination. What transformed a desperate small-time grifter into America's most sophisticated financial criminal? The answer isn't what you'd expect. Elizabeth didn't stumble into wealth through luck or accident. She engineered every step with calculating precision, studying her targets like a scientist studies lab rats. Her weapon wasn't violence or technological expertise. Her weapon was something far more dangerous. She understood exactly how rich men thought about money, power, and status. She recognized that America's banking elite, for all their sophistication, harbored a secret insecurity. They desperately wanted to be part of the Carnegie inner circle, but never would be. Let me take you back to 1889, when Elizabeth Bigley first realized that people's greed could be turned into her fortune. She was 22 years old, recently released from jail and completely broke. She had $3 to her name and no prospects except returning to the streets of Toledo. The America she emerged into was transforming rapidly. Andrew Carnegie was building a steel empire that would make him the richest man alive. J.P. Morgan was consolidating railroads and banks with ruthless efficiency. Cornelius Vanderbilt was multiplying his inherited fortune through shipping and real estate. These men weren't just wealthy. They were creating new categories of wealth that ordinary people couldn't even comprehend. But Elizabeth Bigley noticed something else. She noticed how desperately everyone wanted proximity to these titans. She watched middle-class businessmen boast about meeting a Carnegie associate. She observed how bankers' voices changed when they mentioned handling Rockefeller family investments. She understood that in America's new Gilded Age, being connected to extreme wealth was almost as valuable as having wealth itself. What most people don't know is that Elizabeth Bigley spent months studying financial newspapers, learning the names of Carnegie's business partners, memorizing the details of major steel deals, understanding how banking relationships actually worked. She wasn't just planning another small-time con, she was preparing for something unprecedented. Behind the mansion parties and newspaper headlines was a woman who had identified a massive flaw in how America's financial system operated. Banks in 1904 didn't have the verification systems we take for granted today. There was no instant communication between cities, no centralized credit reporting, no way to quickly confirm whether someone claiming Carnegie family connections was telling the truth. More importantly, she realized that wealthy bankers didn't want to verify those connections too carefully. If a well-dressed woman claimed to be Carnegie's daughter and offered them access to Carnegie investments, their greed overcame their skepticism. They wanted to believe her story because believing it could make them unimaginably rich. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, status, and the peculiar psychology of America's new aristocracy. Elizabeth Bigley became Cassie Chadwick because she understood that in a country obsessed with wealth, the illusion of extreme wealth was almost as powerful as the real thing. But to understand how a convicted prostitute convinced America's banking establishment to hand her millions, we need to go back to the beginning, to a farmhouse in rural Ontario, where a brilliant, ruthless mind was first learning that rules were meant to be broken. Chapter 1. Humble Beginnings. Elizabeth Bigley's first lesson in deception came at age 12, when she convinced her teacher that another student had stolen her homework. The truth? Elizabeth had never done the assignment, but she delivered her lie with such conviction, such wounded innocence, that the teacher not only believed her, but also punished the innocent boy. That October afternoon in 1869, watching her classmate get switched while she escaped consequences, Elizabeth discovered her superpower. People wanted to believe her. She was born Elizabeth Bigley on October 10, 1857, in a one-room farmhouse outside Woodstock, Ontario. Her father, Daniel Bigley, scratched out a living growing potatoes and corn on 40 acres of stubborn soil. Her mother, Alice, took in laundry and mending to supplement their meager farm income. They were poor, not romanticized movie poor, but genuinely desperate poor. The Bigley farmhouse had no indoor plumbing, no gas lighting, no heat except from a single wood-burning stove. During Ontario winters, ice formed on the inside of windows. Elizabeth shared a bed with her two younger sisters, sleeping under quilts made from fabric scraps her mother collected from wealthy households' discarded clothing. But Elizabeth possessed something her family lacked, an acute awareness that poverty was a choice, not a destiny. While her sisters accepted their circumstances, Elizabeth studied the differences between families who struggled and families who prospered. She noticed that prosperity seemed less about working harder and more about working smarter, or more precisely, about convincing others to work for you. By age 14, Elizabeth had identified her path out of rural poverty. She began spending afternoons at Woodstock's train station, observing wealthy travelers passing through town. She studied their clothes, their mannerisms, their speech patterns. She practiced mimicking their accents until she could sound like she'd been educated in Boston finishing schools. Her first successful con targeted Mrs. Margaret Caldwell, Woodstock's wealthiest widow. Elizabeth appeared at the Caldwell mansion claiming to be the orphaned daughter of a deceased Montreal businessman. She wove an elaborate story about her father's shipping company, her mother's tragic death, her desperate need for temporary shelter until inheritance matters were resolved. Mrs. Caldwell, lonely and charitable, invited Elizabeth to stay in her guest room. For 3 weeks, Elizabeth lived like the wealthy young lady she pretended to be. She studied how rich people ate, spoke, and conducted themselves. She memorized the names of prominent families, learned which books educated women discussed, absorbed the subtle social codes that separated aristocracy from everybody else. When Mrs. Caldwell discovered Elizabeth was lying, a neighbor recognized her as the Bigley farm girl. Elizabeth didn't panic. Instead, she claimed she'd been testing Mrs. Caldwell's Christian charity. She suggested that truly righteous people would help poor girls regardless of their background. She twisted the discovery into a moral lesson, making Mrs. Caldwell feel guilty for caring about Elizabeth's origins. Remarkably, it worked. Mrs. Caldwell allowed Elizabeth to continue living with her, though now as a charity case rather than a guest. But Elizabeth had accomplished her real goal. She'd proven that with enough confidence and preparation, she could convince anyone of anything. The Caldwell deception taught Elizabeth 3 crucial lessons that would define her criminal career. First, people believed what they wanted to believe, especially when believing made them feel generous or important. Second, the best lies contained enough truth to feel credible. She really was an orphan since her parents had essentially abandoned her. Third, getting caught didn't mean failure if you could reframe discovery as part of your original plan. At 16, Elizabeth left the Caldwell house in Woodstock behind forever. She took the train to London, Ontario, carrying nothing but stolen jewelry from Mrs. Caldwell's guest room and an unshakable confidence in her ability to manipulate human nature. London, Ontario in 1873 was a booming railway town filled with opportunities for someone willing to bend rules. Elizabeth rented a room in a boarding house and began working as a fortune teller, calling herself Madame de Vere. She claimed to have learned mystical arts from Romani travelers in Eastern Europe. The fortune teller persona served multiple purposes. It allowed her to study wealthy clients' fears and desires while they paid her for the privilege. She learned that rich people worried about the same things as poor people: love, death, money, status, but felt guilty about admitting those worries. She discovered that speaking with exotic accent and mysterious authority made people confess secrets they'd never tell their closest friends. More importantly, fortune-telling taught her to read people instantly. She learned to spot tells that revealed whether someone was desperate, lonely, greedy, or afraid. She developed an almost supernatural ability to identify what each person needed to hear and then deliver exactly that message in the most convincing way possible. Within 6 months, Madame de Vere had become London's most popular fortune teller. Wealthy wives visited secretly to ask about their husband's fidelity. Businessmen paid premium fees for predictions about investments. Even the town's Methodist minister consulted her privately about his spiritual doubts. But Elizabeth was already planning her next evolution. Fortune-telling generated decent income, but it required constant work for relatively small returns. She wanted bigger scores, and she'd identified her method, assuming the identities of wealthy women who couldn't be easily verified. Her opportunity came when she read about Lydia de Vere, a wealthy Boston widow who had died suddenly while traveling in Europe. The newspaper obituary mentioned that Mrs. de Vere had no immediate family and that her estate was being handled by distant relatives who barely knew her. Elizabeth saw immediately how she could become Lydia de Vere. The real Lydia was dead, which eliminated the risk of encountering her. The death had occurred in Europe, making verification difficult. The estate executors had never met Lydia personally, so they couldn't identify an imposter. Within 2 weeks, Elizabeth had created complete backstory for herself as Lydia de Vere. She memorized details about Boston society, practiced speaking with educated Massachusetts accent, and acquired appropriate clothing using money stolen from fortune-telling clients. But before she could execute the Lydia de Vere deception, local authorities began investigating Madame de Vere's activities. Several clients had complained about missing jewelry after fortune-telling sessions. Elizabeth realized she needed to disappear immediately. On a cold December morning in 1873, Madame de Vere vanished from London, Ontario. She left behind unpaid rent, confused clients, and a growing reputation for supernatural abilities. But she'd also accomplished something remarkable. She'd transformed from Elizabeth Bigley, desperate farm girl, into someone who could convincingly impersonate wealthy sophistication. The 16-year-old woman who boarded the train to Toronto that morning carried forged documents identifying her as Lydia de Vere, a Boston widow traveling to Canada for business purposes. She had $50 in stolen jewelry and cash, detailed knowledge about New England society, and absolute confidence in her ability to make people believe whatever she needed them to believe. She had no idea that within 15 years, she would become the most famous fraud artist in American history. Chapter 2: First Deceptions. The Lydia de Vere persona lasted exactly 11 days before Elizabeth encountered a problem she hadn't anticipated: Mrs. Harrison Fletcher, who had actually known the real Lydia de Vere in Boston. Elizabeth was dining at Toronto's finest hotel, playing her role as the sophisticated Boston widow, when Mrs. Fletcher approached her table. "Lydia, what a wonderful surprise! I had no idea you were traveling to Canada." In that moment, Elizabeth faced her first major test as a professional criminal. She could have panicked, confessed, or simply fled. Instead, she did something that revealed her evolving sophistication. She turned the potential disaster into an opportunity. "I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else," Elizabeth replied with perfect composure. "I'm Lydia's cousin, Catherine de Vere. People often comment on our resemblance. Are you perhaps Mrs. Fletcher? Lydia mentioned you many times before her tragic death." Mrs. Fletcher was devastated to learn of Lydia's death. Elizabeth spun an elaborate story about a carriage accident in France, funeral arrangements in Paris, and her own journey to Toronto to handle Lydia's Canadian business interests. By the end of their conversation, Mrs. Fletcher was offering to help Catherine DeVere with anything she needed during her stay. More crucially, Elizabeth pumped Mrs. Fletcher for information about the real Lydia's life, friends, and business connections. She learned names, addresses, and personal details that made her impersonation more convincing. When Mrs. Fletcher departed, Elizabeth possessed enough authentic information to sustain the Catherine DeVere identity indefinitely. This encounter taught Elizabeth a vital lesson. The key to successful long-term deception wasn't avoiding discovery, but rather managing discovery when it inevitably occurred. Quick thinking and social manipulation could transform dangerous situations into advantageous ones. Over the following months, Catherine DeVere established herself in Toronto's social circles. She rented an expensive apartment, hired domestic help, and threw intimate dinner parties for the city's elite. She claimed to be evaluating Canadian investment opportunities on behalf of her deceased cousin's estate. The investment angle was brilliant strategy. It explained why she had substantial money to spend while also justifying her need to borrow additional funds for opportunities that required immediate cash. She convinced several wealthy Torontonians to lend her money for supposedly lucrative ventures, promising enormous returns once her American assets were liquidated. Elizabeth was learning to think like a businesswoman rather than a simple thief. Instead of stealing individual items, she was stealing entire financial relationships. Instead of targeting one victim at a time, she was creating networks of victims who vouched for each other's involvement with her schemes. But she was also growing restless with Toronto's limited opportunities. She'd extracted perhaps $3,000 from various social connections, significant money for someone who'd started with nothing, but far less than what she believed herself capable of achieving. Her breakthrough came when she met Dr. Leroy Chadwick, a wealthy widowed physician who was visiting Toronto for a medical conference. Dr. Chadwick was immediately smitten with the sophisticated, well-connected Catherine DeVere. He was even more impressed when she casually mentioned her connections to prominent Boston families and her substantial inherited wealth. Dr. Chadwick lived in Cleveland, Ohio, a rapidly growing industrial city filled with new money and social climbers. He painted a picture of Cleveland society that fascinated Elizabeth, wealthy but not yet sophisticated, eager to associate with Eastern establishment figures, and relatively isolated from Boston or New York social verification networks. When Dr. Chadwick proposed marriage after a 2-week courtship, Elizabeth accepted immediately. But she insisted on a condition that revealed her long-term planning. She wanted to keep the DeVere name for business purposes, becoming Mrs. Cassie DeVere Chadwick. This would allow her to maintain her fictional Boston connections while acquiring the social legitimacy of a respected physician's wife. The wedding took place in October 1882, with Elizabeth now 25 years old and completely reinvented. She was no longer the desperate farm girl or the small-time fortune teller. She was Mrs. Cassie Chadwick, wife of a prominent Cleveland doctor, connected to Boston's elite families, and possessed of inherited wealth that excused any temporary cash flow problems. But Elizabeth's transformation into Cassie wasn't complete. She still needed to establish credible backstory for her wealth, create ongoing income streams that didn't depend on her husband's medical practice, and position herself for much larger financial opportunities. Cleveland in 1882 was perfect for these goals. The city was experiencing explosive growth due to steel production and shipping industries. New fortunes were being made monthly, and social hierarchies remained fluid enough for newcomers to quickly establish prominent positions. Cassie immediately began cultivating relationships with Cleveland's banking community. She opened accounts at multiple banks, always mentioning her substantial assets being managed by Boston trustees. She hosted dinner parties for bank presidents and their wives, serving expensive food and wine that subtly demonstrated her wealth. Most importantly, she began dropping hints about her family's connections to major American industrialists. She never claimed direct relationships, but rather suggested complex business partnerships and social connections that were difficult to verify but impressive to contemplate. The hints worked exactly as intended. Cleveland bankers began competing for opportunities to handle Cassie's financial affairs. They assumed that anyone connected to Boston's established wealth would eventually bring substantial business to whatever bank earned her loyalty. This competition gave Cassie enormous leverage. When she needed temporary loans for investment opportunities, multiple banks offered favorable terms. When she required letters of credit for travel or purchases, bank presidents personally guaranteed her creditworthiness. Within 2 years of arriving in Cleveland, Cassie Chadwick had established herself as one of the city's most prominent social figures. She served on charity boards, hosted fundraising events, and was regularly featured in newspaper society pages. Her husband's medical practice prospered partly due to wealthy patients who sought access to Cassie's social circle. But Cassie was already planning her next evolution. She'd successfully established local credibility and financial relationships. Now she needed to create the illusion of truly spectacular wealth that would allow her to borrow massive amounts while seeming to offer lenders access to even greater fortunes. Her inspiration came from studying newspaper coverage of Andrew Carnegie's business dealings. Carnegie wasn't just wealthy, he was America's symbol of unlimited industrial fortune. His name appeared constantly in financial newspapers, usually in connection with deals involving millions of dollars. Cassie realized that claiming connection to Carnegie could unlock opportunities that Boston family connections never could. Carnegie represented the pinnacle of American capitalism. Any banker who believed he had access to Carnegie investments would be willing to take enormous risks for potential enormous rewards. But claiming Carnegie connections required far more sophisticated preparation than her previous deceptions. Carnegie was a living public figure, surrounded by well-known associates and business partners. His movements were tracked by newspapers nationwide. Any false claims could be quickly verified and exposed. Cassie spent months researching Carnegie's family background, business relationships, and personal habits. She studied his company's organizational structure, memorized the names of his key executives, and learned the details of his major steel contracts. More importantly, she began developing a story that could explain her connection to Carnegie, while accounting for why that connection wasn't publicly known. She needed a relationship that was secret for credible reasons, profitable for both parties, and impossible for outsiders to easily verify. By early 1885, Cassie had identified her opportunity. She would claim to be Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, a secret he was desperate to keep hidden, but also a person he felt obligated to support financially. The illegitimate daughter story was perfect for multiple reasons. It explained why their relationship wasn't public knowledge. It justified why Carnegie would provide her with substantial ongoing support. It created urgency around maintaining secrecy that discouraged too much verification. And it positioned her as someone who could potentially inherit a portion of Carnegie's fortune. But before she could begin claiming Carnegie connections, Cassie needed to test her abilities on a larger stage. Cleveland had served as excellent training ground, but her ultimate goal required operating in major financial centers where the stakes and opportunities were much higher. She decided her first test would be New York City, the heart of American finance, where the most sophisticated bankers and investors could evaluate her credibility. If she could convince Wall Street professionals that she was worth their attention, she could convince anyone. In the spring of 1885, Mrs. Cassie Chadwick began planning her assault on New York's financial district. She had no idea that within 20 years, her name would be synonymous with the largest banking fraud in American history. Chapter 3. The Reinvention. On Cassie's first morning in New York City, she stood on the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street, watching America's financial elite rush to their offices. Men in expensive suits carried leather briefcases worth more than most families earned annually. Carriages bearing family crests dropped off passengers at marble-columned buildings that housed unimaginable wealth. She was studying her future victims. The year was 1885, and New York's financial district was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. Railroad consolidation, steel production, and industrial expansion had created fortunes that dwarfed anything previously seen in American history. But Cassie noticed something else. These newly wealthy men possessed an insecurity that she could exploit. They had money, but they lacked the generational prestige of European aristocracy. They commanded vast business enterprises, but they craved social acceptance from established families. Most importantly, they competed constantly with each other for access to the most exclusive investment opportunities. Cassie had arrived in New York with detailed plans for claiming Carnegie connections, but she realized her preparation was insufficient. New York's financial community was far more sophisticated than Cleveland's provincial banking circles. These men had direct access to Carnegie's associates, personal relationships with other industrial titans, and the resources to quickly verify any suspicious claims. She needed to establish credibility gradually, building relationships and reputation before making any dramatic revelations about her background. Cassie rented an expensive apartment on Fifth Avenue, using money borrowed against her Cleveland properties. She hired a full household staff, acquired a wardrobe suitable for New York society, and began attending the city's most exclusive social events. Her strategy was brilliant in its patience. Instead of immediately claiming Carnegie connections, she positioned herself as a wealthy Ohio widow with mysterious but substantial assets. She let others speculate about her background while she studied New York's social dynamics. Within 6 months, Cassie had identified the key players in New York's financial aristocracy. She learned who was genuinely wealthy versus who was maintaining appearances. She discovered which men were insecure about their social standing and therefore susceptible to flattery. Most importantly, she identified the specific individuals who had actual business relationships with Andrew Carnegie. Her breakthrough came at a charity fundraiser for St. Patrick's Cathedral, where she was introduced to Hamilton Greer, one of Carnegie's personal bankers. Greer managed several Carnegie family accounts and frequently traveled to Pittsburgh for business meetings. Cassie approached the relationship carefully. She never directly claimed Carnegie connections during their initial conversations. Instead, she mentioned casual familiarity with Pittsburgh's social circles, dropped references to Scottish cultural events that Carnegie was known to attend, and demonstrated detailed knowledge about steel industry operations. Greer was intrigued by this sophisticated woman who seemed to understand Carnegie's world without claiming direct involvement. When Cassie mentioned that she sometimes conducted confidential business in Pittsburgh, Greer offered to introduce her to other Carnegie associates. This was exactly the opening Cassie needed. Through Greer, she gained access to a network of bankers, lawyers, and business managers who worked with Carnegie's various enterprises. She began attending private dinners and business meetings where Carnegie's activities were discussed openly. Cassie absorbed every detail about Carnegie's personality, business practices, and family relationships. She learned that he was intensely private about personal matters, frequently traveled between Pittsburgh and New York, and maintained complex financial arrangements that even his closest associates didn't fully understand. More importantly, she discovered that Carnegie's business partners often speculated about his personal life. They knew he had complicated relationships with family members, suspected he provided financial support to various individuals, and assumed he maintained secret arrangements that protected his public reputation. After 8 months of careful observation, Cassie was ready to begin her transformation into Carnegie's daughter. But she understood that this claim had to be introduced subtly, through implications and hints rather than direct statements. Her opportunity came during a dinner party at Hamilton Greer's home, where several Carnegie associates were discussing a recent steel industry consolidation. Cassie listened quietly until someone mentioned Carnegie's well-known generosity toward various charitable causes. "Yes, he's remarkably generous," Cassie said carefully, "particularly toward individuals who have personal reasons to appreciate his discretion." The comment was deliberately ambiguous, but it carried clear implications. When pressed for details, Cassie claimed she couldn't discuss private matters involving living individuals, but her reluctance to elaborate only increased everyone's curiosity. Over the following weeks, Cassie gradually revealed more information about her supposed relationship with Carnegie. She claimed to possess documents that proved her parentage, but insisted they were too sensitive to show anyone. She mentioned receiving regular financial support from Carnegie, but suggested that acknowledging their relationship publicly would damage his reputation. The story was perfectly calibrated to exploit human psychology. The men who heard these claims wanted to believe them because believing would give them access to unprecedented investment opportunities. But the secrecy requirement meant they couldn't verify the story without potentially damaging their relationship with both Cassie and Carnegie. Cassie's masterstroke was producing what appeared to be a promissory note signed by Andrew Carnegie, guaranteeing payment of $5 million upon his death. She showed this document to Hamilton Greer during a private meeting, claiming it represented only a portion of her inheritance. The promissory note was an elaborate forgery, but Greer had no way to verify its authenticity without confronting Carnegie directly, something he was unwilling to do based on mere suspicion. More importantly, the note seemed consistent with Carnegie's known personality and business practices. Greer was convinced. Within days, he was spreading word throughout New York's financial community that Cassie Chadwick possessed Carnegie family documents worth millions of dollars. He offered to use these documents as collateral for any loans she might require. Cassie had achieved exactly what she intended. She now had respected Carnegie associate, vouching for her claims, without ever directly stating that Carnegie was her father. The relationship was implied, supported by apparently authentic documentation, and endorsed by someone whose professional reputation depended on accurate evaluation of financial opportunities. But Cassie understood that maintaining this deception required constant, careful management. She needed to borrow money in ways that seemed consistent with someone who possessed vast future wealth, but required current liquidity for investment purposes. She began approaching banks with requests for loans secured by her Carnegie inheritance documents. She claimed to need immediate funds for time-sensitive business opportunities, promising to repay with substantial interest once her inheritance was settled. The requests were irresistible to ambitious bankers. If Cassie really was Carnegie's daughter, lending to her meant gaining access to Carnegie family business. Even if her claims were questionable, the potential rewards justified significant risks. Within 6 months, Cassie had borrowed over $200,000 from various New York banks. She used this money to maintain her expensive lifestyle, repay earlier loans, and create the impression of ongoing financial success that supported her Carnegie connection claims. But she was also preparing for the next phase of her operation, expanding beyond New York to create a national network of banking relationships. She realized that her ultimate goal, extracting millions of dollars rather than thousands, required operating across multiple cities simultaneously. The strategy was brilliant. By borrowing from banks in different cities, she could use loans from one institution to make payments to another, creating the illusion of massive cash flow while actually operating with very little real money. Cassie spent the winter of 1886 traveling between Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., establishing relationships with banks in each city. She always presented herself as Carnegie's daughter, supported her claims with forged documents, and requested loans for supposedly urgent investment opportunities. Each new banking relationship strengthened her overall credibility. When Boston bankers checked her references, they found that she was already doing business with respected New York institutions. When Philadelphia banks investigated her background, they discovered existing relationships with prominent Boston financiers. By 1887, Cassie Chadwick had created a financial network that spanned the entire eastern seaboard. She had active credit lines with over 20 banks, ongoing borrowing capacity worth nearly $1 million, and a reputation as one of America's most well-connected investors. But she had also attracted attention from people who could destroy her entire operation with a single conversation. Andrew Carnegie's actual business associates were beginning to hear rumors about his mysterious daughter. Some were curious enough to investigate further. Cassie realized she needed to either escalate her operation dramatically or risk exposure through increased scrutiny. She chose escalation. Her plan was audacious. She would claim that Carnegie was planning to transfer substantial assets to her in the near future, requiring immediate borrowing capacity worth several $1 million. She would use this money to create legitimate business investments that could generate actual returns, gradually reducing her dependence on borrowed funds while maintaining her aristocratic lifestyle. The strategy required perfect execution and enormous confidence. One mistake, one skeptical banker who demanded too much verification, one Carnegie associate who asked too many questions could destroy everything she had built. But Elizabeth Bigley had learned long ago that the greatest risks often produced the greatest rewards. As 1887 drew to a close, Cassie Chadwick began preparing for the most ambitious financial fraud in American history. She had no idea that she was about to steal $20 million from the most sophisticated banking system in the world. Chapter 4. Carnegie's Daughter. The performance of Cassie's lifetime began on a cold February morning in 1901, when she walked into the offices of Reynolds and Company, one of Cleveland's most prestigious law firms. She carried a leather satchel and wore an expression of urgent distress that immediately commanded attention. "Gentlemen," she announced to the assembled lawyers, "I need your absolute discretion regarding a matter of extreme delicacy involving Andrew Carnegie and his family." What happened next would become the cornerstone of the largest financial fraud in American history. But it started with a piece of theater so convincing that even sophisticated legal professionals would later swear they witnessed authentic Carnegie family business. Cassie claimed that Carnegie had summoned her to New York for an emergency meeting regarding family financial arrangements. She produced what appeared to be a telegram from Carnegie's office, requesting her immediate presence at his Fifth Avenue mansion. The story was perfectly calibrated to seem credible. Carnegie was known to have complex feelings about his Scottish heritage. He had indeed immigrated as a young man under circumstances that weren't entirely clear. His enormous wealth and well-documented guilt about poverty made supporting a secret daughter psychologically consistent. More importantly, the illegitimate daughter explanation justified why their relationship required absolute secrecy. Carnegie's public reputation depended on maintaining certain moral standards. Acknowledging an illegitimate child would damage his standing with religious and social conservatives whose opinions he valued. Cassie's masterstroke was requesting that Reynolds accompany her to New York as her legal representative during the Carnegie meeting. This gave Reynolds direct involvement in what he believed was authentic Carnegie family business, making him a powerful witness to her claims. The journey to New York was carefully choreographed to build Reynolds' confidence in Cassie's story. She demonstrated intimate knowledge of Carnegie's business operations, personal habits, and family relationships. She showed him what appeared to be previous correspondence from Carnegie, including handwritten notes that matched his known writing style. Most importantly, she never seemed anxious about the upcoming meeting. Someone fabricating Carnegie connections would presumably be nervous about potential exposure. Cassie's calm confidence suggested that she really was preparing to meet her father. When they arrived at Carnegie's Fifth Avenue mansion, Cassie instructed Reynolds to wait in a nearby carriage while she conducted private family business. She entered the mansion's front door and disappeared for exactly 90 minutes, long enough to suggest substantial business discussions, but not so long as to test Reynolds' patience. What Reynolds didn't know was that Cassie had never met Carnegie. She had simply walked through the mansion's front door, convinced the staff she was expected for a confidential appointment, and spent 90 minutes in Carnegie's library reading his personal correspondence and business documents. Carnegie himself was traveling in Europe and wouldn't return for several weeks. His household staff, accustomed to managing confidential meetings in his absence, assumed Cassie was one of many business associates who frequently visited for various purposes. When Cassie emerged from the mansion, she carried what appeared to be freshly signed legal documents. She seemed emotionally drained, as if she'd experienced intense family negotiations. She told Reynolds that Carnegie had agreed to provide substantial financial support, but required complex arrangements to protect his public reputation. The documents she showed Reynolds were sophisticated forgeries that appeared to establish a $5 million trust fund with Cassie as the beneficiary. The papers included Carnegie's signature, a signature Cassie had practiced copying from business letters she'd studied during her mansion visit. Reynolds was completely convinced. He had witnessed what appeared to be authentic Carnegie family business conducted at Carnegie's own residence. The documents bore Carnegie's signature and matched the legal complexity of other family trust arrangements he'd seen. More importantly, Cassie's behavior throughout the entire process had been consistent with someone navigating genuine family financial negotiations. She seemed relieved rather than excited about the trust arrangement, as if she'd been anxious about Carnegie's willingness to acknowledge their relationship. During the return journey to Cleveland, Cassie revealed additional details about her supposed inheritance. She claimed that Carnegie planned to transfer substantial additional assets to her over time, but required gradual implementation to avoid creating public suspicion about their relationship. This gradual transfer explanation was crucial to Cassie's long-term strategy. It meant she could claim access to enormous future wealth while justifying her need for current borrowing to cover immediate expenses and investment opportunities. Back in Cleveland, Reynolds immediately began spreading word throughout the legal and financial community about Cassie's Carnegie connection. He vouched personally for the authenticity of the documents and the legitimacy of her inheritance claims. Reynolds' endorsement was exactly what Cassie needed. He was a respected attorney with an established reputation for evaluating complex financial arrangements. His personal involvement in the Carnegie meeting gave his testimony unprecedented credibility. Within weeks, every major bank in Cleveland was competing for opportunities to serve Carnegie's daughter. Bank presidents who had previously treated Cassie as a valued but ordinary client now recognized her as potentially their most important customer. Cassie immediately began leveraging her enhanced reputation into substantially larger loans. She claimed to need bridge financing, while Carnegie's legal team processed trust fund transfers. She requested credit lines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, promising repayment with substantial interest once her inheritance payments began. The loan request seemed entirely reasonable given her circumstances. Someone expecting to inherit millions from Andrew Carnegie could easily justify borrowing significant amounts for immediate opportunities. The interest payments she offered were generous enough to make the arrangements profitable for banks, even if collection required some effort. But Cassie's true innovation was her approach to collateral. Instead of offering traditional property or securities, she pledged her Carnegie inheritance documents as loan security. This created extraordinary psychological pressure for bank officials evaluating her creditworthiness. If the documents were genuine, and Irie Reynolds' testimony suggested they were, then Cassie's collateral was worth far more than any loans she might request. Rejecting her applications would mean missing opportunities to finance someone with access to Carnegie family wealth. If the documents were fraudulent, then approving loans based on them would represent catastrophic judgment errors that could destroy banking careers. But challenging the document's authenticity meant essentially accusing Andrew Carnegie of fraud, since his signature appeared throughout the paperwork. Bank officials found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't verify the documents without potentially insulting Carnegie, but they couldn't ignore the documents without potentially missing unprecedented business opportunities. Cassie exploited this psychological pressure brilliantly. She never pushed for immediate decisions or seemed anxious about potential rejection. Instead, she calmly explained her financial needs and allowed bank officials to convince themselves that lending to Carnegie's daughter was simply good business. By the end of 1901, Cassie had borrowed over $800,000 from Cleveland banks alone. She used this money to maintain her lavish lifestyle, make strategic payments to earlier creditors, and establish new banking relationships in other cities. But she was also preparing for the next phase of her operation, expanding her borrowing capacity nationwide by convincing banks that her Carnegie inheritance was growing larger and more accessible. Her strategy was to claim that Carnegie was accelerating his asset transfers due to concerns about his advanced age and the complexity of his business empire. This would justify dramatically increased borrowing while creating urgency around loan approvals. The accelerated inheritance story served multiple purposes. It explained why Cassie could suddenly access much larger amounts of Carnegie wealth. It created time pressure that discouraged extended verification processes. And it positioned her as someone whose future borrowing capacity would expand exponentially. As 1902 began, Cassie Chadwick possessed active credit lines worth over $1 million, maintained banking relationships in 6 major cities, and enjoyed a reputation as America's most well-connected investor. She had successfully convinced dozens of sophisticated financiers that she was Andrew Carnegie's secret daughter. She had forged documents that legal experts accepted as authentic Carnegie family papers. She had created a financial network that generated enormous ongoing borrowing capacity, while requiring relatively modest actual payments. But she had also attracted attention that would eventually destroy her. Andrew Carnegie's actual business associates were beginning to hear persistent rumors about his mysterious daughter. Some were sufficiently curious to begin making discreet inquiries about the woman claiming to inherit millions from Carnegie's estate. Cassie realized that her window of opportunity was closing. She needed to extract maximum value from her Carnegie daughter deception before increased scrutiny exposed her fraud. Her solution was characteristically audacious. She would claim that Carnegie was preparing to transfer $20 million to her trust fund, requiring immediate borrowing capacity worth several million dollars to handle associated legal and tax obligations. $20 million in 1902 represented wealth beyond most people's comprehension. It was enough to buy entire railroad companies, develop major industrial facilities, or influence national political elections. But it was also enough to destroy anyone who fraudulently claimed access to such resources. Chapter 5. Banking Conquest. Herbert Newton stood in the marble lobby of Wade Park Banking Company, holding what appeared to be a promissory note signed by Andrew Carnegie for $7 million. As bank president, Newton had evaluated thousands of financial documents during his career. But he had never seen anything quite like this. The date was March 15, 1903, and Cassie Chadwick had just presented Newton with the most audacious loan proposal in Cleveland banking history. She claimed to need immediate access to $2 million, using her Carnegie inheritance documents as collateral. Newton studied the promissory note with growing amazement. The signature appeared authentic. He had seen Carnegie's handwriting on previous business correspondence. The legal language matched the complexity of other Carnegie family financial arrangements. The document even included notarization stamps and witness signatures that seemed entirely legitimate. But the amount was staggering. $7 million represented more money than most banks held in total assets. If genuine, this single document made Cassie Chadwick one of the wealthiest individuals in Ohio. Newton's dilemma was precisely what Cassie had calculated. He couldn't verify the document's authenticity without essentially accusing Andrew Carnegie of fraud, but he couldn't ignore the document without potentially missing the business opportunity of his career. Cassie understood Newton's psychological position perfectly. She had spent months studying his background, learning that he was an ambitious banker who desperately wanted to elevate Wade Park Banking into Cleveland's top financial institution. Serving as primary banker to Carnegie's daughter would accomplish that goal instantly. "Mr. Newton," Cassie said calmly, "I understand your need for careful evaluation. Perhaps you'd prefer to start with a smaller arrangement while you become comfortable with my family's financial situation." This approach was brilliant. By offering to reduce her loan request, Cassie eliminated pressure while simultaneously demonstrating confidence in her claims. Someone forging Carnegie documents would presumably push for maximum immediate gain. Cassie's willingness to accept less suggested she really did have access to vast future resources. Newton agreed to begin with a $500,000 credit line, secured by Cassie's Carnegie promissory note. The arrangement would allow Wade Park Banking to evaluate her creditworthiness gradually while establishing relationship with someone who might bring enormous future business. Within weeks, Cassie was using her Wade Park credit line to spectacular effect. She borrowed substantial amounts to make strategic payments to other banks, creating the appearance of massive cash flow. She used Newton's endorsement of her Carnegie credentials to establish new banking relationships throughout Ohio. But Newton soon realized he had underestimated Cassie's ambitions. She returned monthly with requests for additional credit, claiming that Carnegie was accelerating asset transfers and requiring increased liquidity for various family business purposes. Each new loan request came with additional forged documents that seemed to confirm expanding Carnegie financial commitments. Cassie showed Newton what appeared to be updated trust agreements, revised inheritance schedules, and correspondence from Carnegie's legal team discussing multi-million-dollar asset transfers. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that Cassie had created, using letterhead stolen from Carnegie's office and signatures copied from authentic business correspondence. She had spent months perfecting Carnegie's handwriting style and studying the legal language used in legitimate Carnegie family documents. Newton found himself trapped by the logic of his initial decision. If he had been correct to accept Cassie's Carnegie credentials originally, then her subsequent requests simply reflected evolving family financial arrangements. If he had been wrong initially, then he was already responsible for catastrophic lending decisions. By December 1903, Wade Park Banking had lent Cassie over $1 million, representing the majority of the bank's available capital. Newton was increasingly nervous about the concentration of risk, but Cassie's Carnegie connections seemed to justify extraordinary lending arrangements. Cassie's success at Wade Park opened doors throughout Cleveland's banking community. When other institutions investigated her creditworthiness, they discovered that the city's most respected bank president had personally vouched for her Carnegie family connections. This created a cascade effect that Cassie exploited ruthlessly. She approached Citizens National Bank, claiming that Wade Park couldn't handle her expanding financial needs. She told Union National Bank that she was consolidating Carnegie family accounts to simplify management. She convinced German American Bank that Carnegie was specifically interested in supporting immigrant-friendly financial institutions. Each bank believed they were competing for access to Carnegie wealth. None wanted to miss opportunities to serve someone with apparent connections to America's richest man. The competitive pressure led to increasingly generous loan terms and reduced verification requirements. Cassie's masterstroke was convincing banks to compete against each other for her business. She would request proposals from multiple institutions for the same financial needs, then play their offers against each other to secure optimal arrangements. Citizens National has offered me a 2% rate, she would tell Union National's president, but I prefer maintaining my relationships with institutions that truly understand the Carnegie family's commitment to Cleveland's economic development. This approach was devastatingly effective. Bank presidents found themselves not just evaluating loan risks, but competing for social status associated with serving Carnegie's daughter. Losing her business to rival institutions would represent professional and personal humiliation. By early 1904, Cassie had active credit lines with every major bank in Cleveland. Her total borrowing capacity exceeded $3 million, more than the annual budget of most American cities at the time. But she was also expanding her operations beyond Cleveland into national markets. She established relationships with banks in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, always claiming that Carnegie's expanding business empire required financial services in multiple cities. Her Boston strategy was particularly sophisticated. She approached executives at Old Colony Trust Company, one of New England's most prestigious financial institutions, claiming that Carnegie was planning substantial investments in Boston-area steel facilities. The Old Colony executives were intrigued by opportunities to participate in Carnegie expansion projects. When Cassie offered to introduce them to other Carnegie business associates, they immediately agreed to provide whatever financial services she required. Cassie's introduction to Carnegie associates was actually a dinner party she hosted for Cleveland bankers who already believed her Carnegie claims. The Boston bankers met respected Cleveland financiers who enthusiastically confirmed Cassie's family connections. Neither group realized they were vouching for claims that originated with forged documents. Within 6 months, Cassie had borrowed over $800,000 from Boston banks. She used this money to make payments to Cleveland creditors, creating the appearance of ongoing cash flow that justified her claims about Carnegie asset transfers. Her Philadelphia operations followed the same pattern. She convinced Girard Trust Company that Carnegie was planning major railway investments requiring Philadelphia banking expertise. She showed them correspondence from Cleveland and Boston banks, confirming her creditworthiness and family connections. The multi-city strategy served crucial purposes beyond simply increasing her borrowing capacity. By operating in different markets simultaneously, Cassie made comprehensive verification nearly impossible. No single bank had complete information about her total debt obligations or the true extent of her claims about Carnegie wealth. More importantly, the geographic distribution created psychological pressure for quick loan approvals. Banks in each city worried that institutions in other markets would secure Cassie's primary business relationships if they delayed too long in processing her requests. Cassie exploited this competitive pressure brilliantly. She would tell Philadelphia banks that Boston institutions were offering better terms. She would inform Cleveland banks that East Coast competitors were more experienced with Carnegie family business. She created constant urgency around loan decisions while discouraging extended verification processes. By summer 1904, Cassie Chadwick had borrowed over $6 million from banks across 4 states. She maintained active credit lines worth additional millions and enjoyed relationships with over 40 banking institutions. Her monthly income from borrowing exceeded what most American families earned in entire lifetimes. She owned mansions in 3 cities, employed dozens of servants, and threw parties that cost more than most businesses' annual profits. But she had also created obligations that were becoming impossible to manage. Her monthly interest payments exceeded $50,000. Her need for new loans to service existing debt was growing exponentially, and her total claims about Carnegie wealth had reached levels that were attracting dangerous attention. Carnegie's actual business associates were beginning to hear persistent rumors about his secret daughter, with access to millions in family assets. Some were sufficiently concerned to begin discreet inquiries with Carnegie's staff about family financial arrangements. Cassie realized that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She needed to either find ways to generate legitimate income that could reduce her dependence on borrowed money or extract maximum value from her operations before inevitable exposure. Her decision would determine whether she became a legendary success story or a catastrophic criminal failure. Chapter 6. $1 Million Lies. The telegram arrived at Andrew Carnegie's Skibo Castle estate in Scotland on a crisp September morning in 1904. Carnegie was having breakfast when his private secretary handed him the urgent message from his New York office. Persistent inquiries about daughter Cassie Chadwick, claiming large inheritance. Please advise. Carnegie read the telegram 3 times, his confusion evident to everyone present. "I have no daughter named Cassie Chadwick," he told his secretary. "I have no illegitimate children. This is either a mistake or someone is using my name fraudulently." That same morning, 3,000 miles away in Cleveland, Cassie was sitting in Wade Park Banking Company's boardroom, explaining to nervous bank executives why her latest loan payment was delayed. She had no idea that Carnegie had just learned of her existence. The previous 18 months had been a spectacular success for Cassie's operations. Her total borrowings had reached $12 million across dozens of banks in 6 different states. Her monthly cash flow from new loans exceeded what most corporations generated annually. She lived like American royalty, owning properties worth millions and maintaining a lifestyle that rivaled the wealthiest families in the country. But maintaining this empire required increasingly sophisticated deceptions. Every month brought larger interest payments, more urgent demands for fresh capital, and growing pressure to provide evidence that Carnegie's promised asset transfers were actually occurring. Cassie's solution was to claim that Carnegie was preparing the largest single asset transfer in American business history, $25 million that would be placed in her trust fund by December 1904. This enormous sum would justify her current debt levels while providing collateral for even larger future borrowings. The $25 million claim was audacious, beyond anything she had previously attempted. It represented roughly half of Carnegie's estimated total wealth and more money than most state governments controlled annually. But it was also the only story that could explain her need for immediate access to several $1 million in additional credit. Cassie supported her claim with increasingly elaborate forged documents. She created what appeared to be legal correspondence from Carnegie's attorneys discussing trust fund preparations. She produced fake bank drafts showing Carnegie transferring assets to New York holding companies. She even fabricated newspaper clippings announcing Carnegie's plans for major family financial arrangements. The forged evidence was sophisticated enough to convince even experienced banking professionals. Cassie had spent years studying Carnegie's business operations, learning the names of his associates, and understanding the legal procedures used for large asset transfers. More importantly, the $25 million story created psychological pressure that overwhelmed rational skepticism. Bank presidents who had already lent millions based on Cassie's Carnegie credentials couldn't afford to doubt her claims without admitting catastrophic judgment errors. Herbert Newton at Wade Park Banking was particularly vulnerable to this pressure. His institution had lent Cassie over $2 million, representing the majority of the bank's capital. If her Carnegie connections were fraudulent, Wade Park would face immediate bankruptcy. When Cassie requested an additional $1 million to facilitate legal preparations for the $25 million transfer, Newton found himself with no acceptable alternatives. Rejecting the request meant acknowledging that his previous lending decisions were based on fraudulent collateral. Approving the request meant increasing his exposure to potentially disastrous losses. Newton chose to approve the loan, bringing Wade Park's total exposure to Cassie to over $3 million. His decision was influenced partly by fear and partly by greed. If Cassie really was about to inherit $25 million from Carnegie, serving as her primary banker could make Wade Park the most profitable institution in Ohio. But Newton wasn't the only banking executive trapped by the logic of previous decisions. Across the country, bank presidents were approving increasingly large loans to Cassie based primarily on their inability to acknowledge that earlier loans might have been mistakes. Cassie exploited this psychological trap ruthlessly. She approached each banker with requests that seemed reasonable given their existing commitments to her success. She never demanded immediate decisions or seemed anxious about potential rejection. Instead, she presented each loan request as a natural evolution of established business relationships. By October 1904, Cassie's total borrowings exceeded $15 million. She owed money to over 60 banks in 8 different states. Her monthly interest obligations surpassed $100,000, more than most cities' annual budgets. Maintaining this financial empire required constant manipulation. Cassie used loans from Boston banks to make payments to Cleveland institutions. She borrowed from Philadelphia banks to cover obligations to New York creditors. She created complex webs of cross payments that made tracking her actual financial position nearly impossible. But she was also beginning to make critical errors that would ultimately expose her entire operation. The pressure of managing millions in debt while maintaining her Carnegie deception was causing her to become careless about details that had previously been handled with meticulous precision. Her first major mistake was showing different versions of the same Carnegie documents to different banks. When comparing notes during a regional banking conference, executives discovered that Cassie's supposed inheritance had grown from $7 million to $25 million in less than 2 years. The discrepancies raised questions that Cassie couldn't satisfactorily answer. She claimed that Carnegie had revised the trust arrangements multiple times, but couldn't explain why the revisions always increased rather than decreased her inheritance amounts. More problematically, some bankers began comparing the signature on various Carnegie documents that Cassie had provided as collateral. While her forgeries were individually convincing, subtle differences between signatures created doubts about their authenticity. Cassie's second major error was overestimating her ability to manage timing. She had promised multiple banks that Carnegie's $25 million asset transfer would occur by December 1904. As that deadline approached, she needed to either produce evidence of the transfer or find credible explanations for delays. Her solution was to claim that legal complications were postponing the transfer until early 1905. She produced forged correspondence from Carnegie's attorneys explaining that regulatory approval was required for such large asset movements. But the delay explanations created new problems. Banks that had approved loans based on December transfer promises began demanding additional collateral or accelerated payment schedules. Some institutions started conducting independent investigations of Carnegie's actual family relationships and business arrangements. These investigations represented Cassie's greatest fear realized. Once banks began seriously attempting to verify her claims, her entire operation would collapse within weeks. She needed to either produce convincing evidence of genuine Carnegie connections or find ways to satisfy creditors without relying on Carnegie inheritance promises. Her attempt at a solution revealed both her desperation and her continued faith in audacious deceptions. In November 1904, she claimed that Carnegie had decided to accelerate the asset transfer to avoid potential legal complications, but required her immediate presence in Europe to complete the arrangements. The European trip story served multiple purposes. It explained why she couldn't provide immediate documentation of Carnegie transfers. It created urgency around final loan approvals before her departure. And it positioned her for potential disappearance if her operation became unsustainable. Cassie used the European trip claim to borrow an additional $2 million from various banks, bringing her total debt to over $17 million. She claimed to need immediate liquidity for international legal fees and European business arrangements related to the Carnegie transfer. But while she was extracting these final loans, Carnegie's telegram from Scotland was generating inquiries that would soon expose her entire fraud. Carnegie's New York office had begun investigating the persistent rumors about his daughter, Cassie Chadwick. Within days, Carnegie's attorneys were contacting banks that claimed to hold Carnegie family trust documents. They discovered that dozens of institutions had accepted promissory notes supposedly signed by Carnegie for amounts totaling over $20 million. The investigation revealed that all of these documents were forgeries, that Carnegie had no daughter named Cassie Chadwick, and that the woman claiming Carnegie connections was actually Elizabeth Bigley, a convicted criminal with a long history of financial fraud. As November 1904 drew to a close, Cassie Chadwick commanded a criminal empire worth over $17 million. She lived in unprecedented luxury, commanded respect from America's financial elite, and seemed positioned to continue her operations indefinitely. But she had also attracted attention that would destroy everything she had built. Carnegie's investigation was proceeding rapidly. Banking executives were beginning to compare notes about her claims, and federal authorities were starting to take interest in what appeared to be massive interstate fraud. Cassie had perhaps weeks before exposure became inevitable. Her response to this crisis would determine whether she escaped with millions in stolen money or faced catastrophic criminal prosecution for the largest fraud in American history. Chapter 7. High Society. Mrs. Cassie Chadwick's New Year's Eve party on December 31, 1904, was the social event of Cleveland's season. 250 guests filled her Euclid Avenue mansion, dining on imported French cuisine and drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than most workers earned monthly. The guest list read like a directory of Ohio's elite: bank presidents, steel company executives, railroad magnates, and their wives. Everyone wanted proximity to Carnegie's daughter, especially as rumors circulated about her impending inheritance of $25 million. What none of them knew was that this would be Cassie's final performance as American aristocracy. Standing in her marble foyer, wearing a diamond necklace worth $50,000 and a Worth gown imported from Paris, Cassie surveyed her assembled guests with satisfaction mixed with growing anxiety. She had achieved everything she'd dreamed of since leaving the Ontario farmhouse 30 years earlier. But she also knew that her empire was beginning to crumble. The evening's guest of honor was Hamilton Greer, the Carnegie banker who had first endorsed Cassie's claims in New York. Greer had traveled from Pittsburgh specifically to attend the party, bringing several other Carnegie business associates who were curious to meet the famous heiress. Cassie approached this gathering with characteristic audacity. Instead of avoiding Carnegie's actual associates, she engaged them in detailed conversations about Carnegie's business operations, family relationships, and future plans. Her strategy was to convince them through direct interaction that she really did possess intimate knowledge of Carnegie family affairs. The conversations were treacherous territory. These men had worked with Carnegie for years and knew details about his life that weren't available in newspapers or business publications. Any mistake could expose her immediately. But Cassie had prepared meticulously. During her months of research, she had studied not just Carnegie's public activities, but also private correspondence, family photographs, and personal documents she had accessed during her Manhattan mansion visit. She possessed detailed knowledge about Carnegie's Scottish childhood, his early struggles in America, and his complex feelings about wealth and social responsibility. When Greer mentioned Carnegie's recent visit to his boyhood home in Dunfermline, Scotland, Cassie responded with specific details about the trip that she had learned from reading Carnegie's private letters. When another associate discussed Carnegie's charitable plans, she demonstrated familiarity with foundation projects that hadn't yet been publicly announced. The Carnegie associates were impressed by her knowledge and convinced by her apparent comfort discussing family matters. Her confident participation in these conversations suggested genuine insider access rather than publicly available information. But the evening also revealed growing pressure surrounding Cassie's financial situation. Several banking executives approached her privately to discuss delayed loan payments and overdue interest obligations. The conversations were polite, but increasingly urgent. Herbert Newton pulled her aside during dinner to express concerns about Wade Park Banking's exposure to her debt. "Mrs. Chadwick, our board is becoming nervous about the concentration of our loans. When exactly do you expect the Carnegie transfer to be completed?" Cassie's response demonstrated her continued faith in audacious deception. "Mr. Newton, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that Father's attorneys are finalizing arrangements for immediate asset transfer. In fact, I expect to resolve all outstanding obligations within the next 2 weeks." The 2-week promise was completely fabricated. Cassie had no expectation that Carnegie would transfer any assets because Carnegie didn't know she existed. But she needed to buy time while she figured out either how to satisfy her creditors or how to escape before her fraud was exposed. Newton accepted her assurance because rejecting it would mean acknowledging that Wade Park Banking faced immediate insolvency. The bank had lent over $3 million based on Cassie's Carnegie credentials. If those credentials were fraudulent, the bank would collapse within days. Similar conversations occurred throughout the evening with representatives from other institutions. Citizens National, Union National, German American, and half a dozen other banks had executives present who were growing nervous about their exposure to Cassie's debt. Each banker received essentially the same message. Carnegie asset transfers were imminent, all obligations would be satisfied promptly, and their patience would be rewarded with access to unprecedented future business opportunities. The unified response served crucial purposes. It prevented any single bank from panicking and demanding immediate repayment. It reinforced the illusion that Cassie's financial challenges were temporary liquidity issues rather than fundamental fraud, and it bought her additional time to either resolve her situation or plan her escape. But the evening also included moments that revealed the personal cost of Cassie's criminal career. During a quiet moment in her private study, she found herself alone with Dr. Leroy Chadwick, the Cleveland physician she had married 20 years earlier. Dr. Chadwick had been increasingly isolated from his wife's social and financial activities. He understood that she claimed Carnegie family connections and that her lifestyle far exceeded what his medical practice could support, but he had deliberately avoided asking too many questions about the details. "Cassie," he said quietly, "I hope you understand what you're doing. Some of the conversations I'm overhearing tonight suggest that very important people are depending on you for very large amounts of money." Cassie's response revealed both her continued confidence and her growing desperation. "Leroy, you needn't worry about my financial arrangements. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Within weeks, we'll be wealthier than we ever imagined possible." But privately, she was beginning to acknowledge that her situation might be unsustainable. Her debt exceeded $17 million and was growing daily due to compound interest. Her monthly obligations surpassed her annual borrowing capacity, and increasing scrutiny from banking investigators was making new loans increasingly difficult to obtain. The New Year's Eve party concluded at 3 a.m, with Cassie bidding farewell to guests who had consumed thousands of dollars worth of food and alcohol. Several banking executives departed with renewed confidence in her Carnegie credentials and continued willingness to extend credit for her operations. But others left with growing concerns about the concentration of their institution's risk and the sustainability of her financial arrangements. Some had begun discreet investigations of her claims that could expose her fraud within weeks. January 1905 began with Cassie facing the most challenging period of her criminal career. She needed to either produce convincing evidence of Carnegie asset transfers or find alternative sources of income that could service her massive debt obligations. Her first attempt at a solution involved claiming that Carnegie was preparing to establish a major steel manufacturing facility in Cleveland, with plans to appoint her as primary coordinator for the project. The facility would supposedly require millions in startup capital, justifying substantial additional borrowing while explaining her ongoing financial needs. The Steel facility story was supported by forged correspondence from Carnegie's Pittsburgh office and fake engineering reports about Cleveland area industrial development. Cassie presented these documents to banking executives as evidence that her Carnegie relationship was evolving beyond simple inheritance into active business partnership. Several banks expressed interest in financing the supposed steel facility project. The potential returns from genuine Carnegie business venture justified significant lending risks. More importantly, participating in Carnegie industrial development could elevate regional banks into national prominence. But Cassie's steel facility claims also attracted attention from people who could quickly verify their authenticity. Carnegie's actual business associates began hearing rumors about Cleveland development projects they knew nothing about. By February 1905, banking executives in multiple cities were comparing notes about Cassie's various claims regarding Carnegie family wealth, inheritance arrangements, and business partnerships. The comparisons revealed inconsistencies that raised serious questions about the authenticity of her documentation. More problematically, several banks had begun independent investigations of Carnegie's actual family relationships and business arrangements. These investigations quickly revealed that Carnegie had no daughter named Cassie Chadwick and had never signed promissory notes for the amounts that appeared in her supposed inheritance documents. Cassie realized that comprehensive exposure was becoming inevitable. Her options had narrowed to attempting immediate escape with whatever liquid assets she could gather, or making one final audacious attempt to resolve her situation through additional massive borrowing. Her decision would determine whether she ended her criminal career as a successful escapee with millions in stolen money, or as a federal defendant facing prosecution for the largest financial fraud in American history. As February 1905 progressed, Cassie Chadwick stood at the pinnacle of American criminal achievement and the edge of catastrophic failure. Her next decisions would create either a legendary escape story or a spectacular criminal downfall that would be remembered for generations. Chapter 8. Mounting Pressure. The first crack in Cassie's empire appeared on February 15, 1905, when a junior clerk at Citizens National Bank noticed something troubling while updating loan records. Two different Carnegie promissory notes in Cassie's file bore the exact same date, but different amounts. One for $3 million, another for $5 million. The clerk mentioned this discrepancy to his supervisor, who initially dismissed it as a filing error. But when they examined the documents more carefully, they discovered that both notes bore identical signatures, despite supposedly being signed weeks apart. The signature comparison triggered the first systematic investigation of Cassie's Carnegie documentation. Within days, Citizens National's executives were examining every Carnegie-related document in their possession with forensic precision. What they discovered was devastating. Signature analysis revealed that all of Carnegie's supposed signatures were forgeries created by the same hand. Legal language in the documents contained phrases that Carnegie's actual attorneys never used. Most damaging of all, several documents referenced business arrangements that Carnegie's office confirmed had never existed. Herbert Newton received the Citizens National report on February 20th while sitting in his office at Wade Park Banking. Reading through the evidence of systematic document forgery, he felt his professional world collapsing around him. Wade Park had lent over $3 million based primarily on these same forged documents. If Citizens National's analysis was correct, then Wade Park faced immediate bankruptcy, and Newton himself faced criminal liability for approving fraudulent loans. Newton's first instinct was to deny the evidence. He had personally witnessed what appeared to be authentic Carnegie family business during his meetings with Cassie. He had seen legal documents that seemed entirely legitimate. Most importantly, he had staked his career on Cassie's credibility. But Newton was also an experienced banker who understood the implications of systematic document forgery. If Cassie had created fake Carnegie signatures, she had also likely fabricated inheritance claims, trust arrangements, and asset transfer promises. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Cassie owed Wade Park over $3 million, secured by documents that appeared to be worthless forgeries. The bank's total capital was approximately $4 million. meaning that Cassie's debt represented an existential threat to the institution's survival. Newton faced an impossible choice. He could expose Cassie's fraud immediately, triggering demands for repayment that would certainly bankrupt Wade Park, or he could attempt to collect on her loans privately, hoping to minimize the bank's losses while avoiding public scandal. Newton chose a third option that revealed both his desperation and his continued faith in Cassie's abilities. He decided to confront her directly with the evidence of document forgery, hoping to pressure her into providing legitimate collateral for her existing debt. The confrontation took place in Newton's private office on February 22, 1905. Newton presented Cassie with Citizens National's forensic analysis and demanded immediate explanation for the signature discrepancies. Cassie's response demonstrated her continued mastery of crisis management. Instead of denying the forgeries or expressing surprise at their discovery, she claimed that Carnegie had specifically instructed her to use proxy signatures for security purposes. "Mr. Newton," she explained calmly, "Father was concerned about document security during the transfer process. He arranged for his private secretary to handle routine signatures while he completed the legal preparations in Europe." The proxy signature story was brilliant improvisation. It acknowledged the forensic evidence while providing explanation that seemed consistent with Carnegie's known obsession with privacy and security. More importantly, it suggested that the apparent forgeries were actually legitimate documents created through unconventional but authorized procedures. Newton desperately wanted to believe this explanation because accepting it meant that Wade Park's loans remained secured by authentic Carnegie guarantees. But he was also an experienced enough banker to recognize that proxy signature arrangements would normally be documented through formal legal procedures. When Newton demanded evidence of the proxy signature authorization, Cassie claimed that Carnegie's European attorneys were handling those documents and that formal verification would be available within weeks. The weeks timeline was crucial to Cassie's strategy. She needed time to either produce convincing evidence of legitimate Carnegie connections or arrange her escape before the fraud investigation expanded further. But while Cassie was managing Newton's concerns, other banks were conducting their own investigations that would soon converge into comprehensive exposure of her operations. Citizens National had shared their forensic analysis with other Cleveland banks, creating a coordinated effort to evaluate Cassie's total debt and verify her collateral claims. The investigation quickly revealed that she owed over $12 million to Cleveland institutions alone, all secured by similar Carnegie documents. More problematically, the investigation expanded beyond Cleveland into other cities, where Cassie had established banking relationships. When Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago banks compared their Cassie Chadwick documentation, they discovered identical patterns of signature forgery and fabricated legal language. By early March 1905, banking executives in 6 cities were sharing information about what appeared to be a coordinated fraud involving dozens of institutions and millions of dollars in fake Carnegie guarantees. The multi-city investigation also revealed the sophistication of Cassie's operations. She had successfully convinced banks in different regions to accept virtually identical forged documents while believing they were participating in unique Carnegie family arrangements. More impressive was her coordination of cross-payments between institutions. The investigation showed that she had used loans from Boston banks to make payments to Cleveland institutions, borrowed from Philadelphia banks to cover Chicago obligations, and created complex webs of financial relationships that obscured her actual debt levels. Federal investigators became involved when the scope of apparent interstate fraud became clear. The Post Office Department, responsible for investigating mail fraud, began examining Cassie's use of forged documents to obtain loans from banks in multiple states. The federal investigation quickly confirmed what banking executives had begun to suspect. Cassie Chadwick was not Andrew Carnegie's daughter, had never possessed legitimate claim to Carnegie wealth, and had systematically defrauded dozens of banks using forged documents. More damaging was the investigation's revelation of Cassie's actual identity. Federal investigators discovered that Mrs. Cassie Chadwick was actually Elizabeth Bigley, a convicted criminal with previous arrests for fraud, forgery, and prostitution. The Elizabeth Bigley discovery was devastating to banks that had based lending decisions on Cassie's claims of aristocratic background and Carnegie family connections. Learning that their supposedly sophisticated client was actually a repeat offender with extensive criminal history destroyed any remaining hope that her debt could be recovered through legitimate means. By March 10, 1905, the banking community's investigation had revealed the scope of Cassie's fraud. Over $20 million in loans obtained through forged documents, fake inheritance claims, and systematic deception of banking officials across multiple states. The $20 million figure represented the largest financial fraud in American history. It exceeded the annual budgets of most state governments and rivaled the market capitalization of major corporations. More importantly, the investigation revealed that Cassie had continued borrowing even after banks began questioning her documentation. Her February 1905 loan requests suggested that she was either unaware of the expanding investigation or confident in her ability to resolve the situation through additional deception. Federal investigators were particularly interested in understanding how Cassie had convinced sophisticated banking professionals to approve such enormous loans based on relatively simple document forgeries. The investigation revealed systematic weaknesses in banking verification procedures that had allowed her fraud to expand far beyond what should have been possible. As March 1905 progressed, Cassie found herself surrounded by investigations that were rapidly approaching comprehensive exposure of her criminal empire. Federal agents were tracking her financial transactions, banking executives were coordinating efforts to minimize their losses, and Carnegie's attorneys were publicly denouncing any claimed connection between Carnegie and the woman known as Cassie Chadwick. Her options had narrowed to immediate escape, or making one final attempt to resolve her situation through additional audacious deception. But with federal investigators monitoring her activities and banks refusing new loan applications, escape was becoming her only viable alternative. The woman who had commanded respect from America's financial elite and lived like European royalty now faced the prospect of federal prosecution for the largest fraud in American history. Her response to this crisis would determine whether she ended her criminal career in federal prison or as a legendary escapee who had stolen $20 million from the American banking system. Chapter 9. Fatal Mistake. Cassie made the decision that would destroy her on March 15, 1905, when she walked into the offices of the Oberlin National Bank and attempted to borrow another $500,000 using forged Carnegie documents that federal investigators were already tracking. The Oberlin loan request revealed how completely Cassie had misread her situation. While banking executives across the country were coordinating investigations of her fraud, while federal agents were building criminal cases against her, while Carnegie's attorneys were publicly denouncing her claims, she continued operating as if her deceptions remained undiscovered. Her confidence was partly justified by previous experience. For 20 years, Cassie had successfully talked her way out of dangerous situations through audacious lies and social manipulation. She had convinced skeptical bank presidents, legal professionals, and Carnegie associates that she was someone entirely different than her actual identity. But her confidence also reflected a crucial blindness to how dramatically her situation had changed. The banking community investigation had eliminated the isolation between institutions that had previously protected her fraud. Federal involvement had created centralized oversight that made her cross-jurisdictional operations visible to law enforcement. Most importantly, Carnegie's direct denial of any relationship with her had removed the ambiguity that her deceptions required. The Oberlin National Meeting was attended by Bank President Charles Beckwith, who had already received warnings from other institutions about Cassie's fraudulent activities. When she presented her Carnegie promissory note as collateral for the requested loan, Beckwith immediately recognized the document as matching forgeries that other banks had identified. Instead of approving the loan, Beckwith triggered a plan that banking executives had developed for exactly this situation. He kept Cassie in his office while his assistant contacted federal authorities, Cleveland police, and representatives from other banks that had been defrauded by her operations. Cassie initially assumed that Beckwith was conducting routine verification procedures. She had grown accustomed to banking delays and bureaucratic requirements that accompanied large loan requests. When Beckwith suggested they wait for additional documentation, She agreed without suspecting that federal agents were already en route to arrest her. The conversation that followed revealed both Cassie's continued confidence and her complete misunderstanding of her situation. She spent 30 minutes explaining her Carnegie family connections to Beckwith, demonstrating detailed knowledge of Carnegie's business operations and personal relationships. Her performance was as compelling as ever. She spoke with absolute conviction about family meetings, inheritance arrangements, and future asset transfers. She answered Beckwith's questions with specific details that seemed to demonstrate genuine insider knowledge. But Beckwith was no longer evaluating her claims for potential business opportunities. He was stalling for time while federal agents prepared to arrest her for what they had already determined was systematic fraud involving forged documents and false identity claims. When Deputy U.S. Marshal James Carter arrived at the Oberlin National Bank at 2:30 p.m., he found Cassie still discussing loan arrangements with Beckwith, apparently oblivious to the investigation that had been building around her for weeks. "Mrs. Chadwick," Carter announced, "you are under arrest for mail fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal banking regulations." Cassie's reaction revealed both her shock at discovery and her immediate recognition that her criminal career had ended. For the first time in decades, her ability to manipulate situations through confident deception had completely failed. But even during her arrest, Cassie attempted to maintain her Carnegie daughter persona. She demanded to contact Carnegie's attorneys, insisted that federal authorities were making catastrophic mistakes, and threatened legal action against everyone involved in her detention. The threats were empty bluster. Federal investigators had spent weeks building comprehensive evidence of her fraudulent activities. They possessed original documents proving that Elizabeth Bigley had assumed multiple false identities, forged numerous Carnegie signatures, and systematically defrauded banks across multiple states. More damaging was their discovery of her criminal background. Federal investigators had traced her activities back to her original identity as Elizabeth Bigley, revealing previous arrests, convictions, and fraudulent schemes dating back 20 years. The Elizabeth Bigley revelation was devastating to her remaining supporters. Banking executives who had defended her Carnegie claims based on personal relationships discovered that they had been deceived not just about her family connections, but about her entire identity and background. Dr. Leroy Chadwick learned simultaneously that his wife was a federal criminal and that her actual name was Elizabeth Bigley. The revelation destroyed not only their marriage, but also his medical practice, since patients assumed he had been complicit in her fraudulent activities. Hamilton Greer, the Carnegie banker who had initially endorsed Cassie's claims in New York, found himself facing potential criminal charges for vouching for documents that federal investigators had proven were forgeries. Herbert Newton at Wade Park Banking confronted the reality that his institution faced immediate bankruptcy due to loans based entirely on fraudulent collateral. The bank's board of directors demanded his resignation and threatened legal action for his role in approving such enormous unsecured lending. But the most devastating revelation was the scope of Cassie's fraud. Federal investigators calculated that she had borrowed over $20 million from banks in 8 different states, using exclusively forged documents and false claims about Carnegie family wealth. $20 million in 1905 represented wealth beyond most people's comprehension. It was more than the annual budget of most state governments, exceeded the market capitalization of major corporations, and rivaled the GDP of smaller nations. The investigation also revealed the sophistication of Cassie's cross-jurisdictional operations. She had successfully convinced dozens of banks to accept virtually identical forged documents while believing they were participating in unique financial arrangements. More impressive was her psychological manipulation of banking professionals. Federal investigators documented how she had exploited bankers' greed, social insecurities, and competitive pressures to overcome rational skepticism about her claims. The investigation report noted that Cassie had identified and exploited systematic weaknesses in American banking that went far beyond simple document verification. She had understood that wealthy bankers desperately wanted proximity to Carnegie's level of wealth and had used that desire to overcome their professional caution. As news of Cassie's arrest spread throughout the financial community, banks began evaluating their exposure, to her fraudulent operations. The calculations were catastrophic. Several institutions faced immediate insolvency, dozens more confronted substantial losses, and the entire regional banking system required emergency intervention to prevent collapse. Wade Park Banking closed permanently on March 20, 1905, unable to survive the loss of over $3 million in fraudulent loans. Citizens National required emergency capital infusion from federal authorities to remain operational. German-American Bank faced potential liquidation due to concentrated exposure to Cassie's debt. The banking system damage extended beyond Ohio into other states where Cassie had operated. Boston's Old Colony Trust Company faced losses exceeding $1 million. Philadelphia's Girard Trust Company required emergency board meetings to address potential insolvency. Chicago banks discovered exposure to fraudulent loans worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Federal investigators calculated that Cassie's fraud had destabilized banking systems across the entire eastern United States. Her operations had exposed systematic weaknesses in financial verification procedures that required immediate regulatory response to prevent similar future frauds. But perhaps most remarkable was Cassie's response to her arrest and the revelation of her fraud scope. Even while facing federal prosecution for crimes that could result in decades in prison, she continued attempting to convince authorities that her Carnegie claims were legitimate. During her initial interrogation, Cassie maintained that federal investigators were making devastating mistakes that would embarrass the government once Carnegie confirmed their family relationship. She demanded that authorities contact Carnegie directly to verify her identity and inheritance claims. When investigators informed her that Carnegie had already publicly denied any connection to her, Cassie claimed that Carnegie was protecting both of them by temporarily disavowing their relationship until legal complications could be resolved. Her continued deception revealed both her remarkable psychological commitment to her criminal persona and her inability to acknowledge the complete failure of operations that had defined her identity for over 2 decades. As March 1905 concluded, Elizabeth Bigley sat in federal custody facing prosecution for the largest financial fraud in American history. Her criminal empire had collapsed completely, destroying dozens of banking relationships and destabilizing the financial systems of multiple states. But she had also achieved something unprecedented. She had stolen $20 million from America's most sophisticated banking institutions using nothing but forged documents and masterful psychological manipulation. Whether that achievement would be remembered as criminal genius or catastrophic fraud would depend on how history judged the woman who had transformed from desperate farm girl into the most successful con artist in American history. Chapter 10. House Crumbling. The news broke in Cleveland's morning papers on March 16, 1905, with headlines that stunned the city's elite. Mrs. Cassie Chadwick arrested, alleged Carnegie heiress accused of massive fraud. Within hours, crowds gathered outside her Euclid Avenue mansion as sheriff's deputies began cataloging assets for seizure. The same servants who had served imported delicacies at her New Year's Eve party now watched federal marshals inventory silver, artwork, and furniture worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the physical dismantling of Cassie's empire was far less dramatic than the psychological collapse of everyone who had believed in her carefully constructed identity. Dr. Leroy Chadwick stood in his wife's private study, surrounded by opened safes and scattered papers that federal investigators had left behind. For 20 years, he had lived with a woman he thought was the sophisticated daughter of Boston aristocracy. Now he was learning that she was actually Elizabeth Bigley, a convicted criminal with a history of fraud and prostitution. The revelation destroyed more than their marriage. Dr. Chadwick's medical practice, which had prospered partly due to wealthy patients seeking access to his wife's social circle, evaporated overnight. Former patients cancelled appointments, unpaid bills went uncollected, and his professional reputation became permanently associated with criminal fraud. "How could I have been so blind?" he confided to his attorney. She spoke about Carnegie family gatherings, mentioned specific conversations with his business associates, and demonstrated intimate knowledge of his personal habits. How could all of that have been fabricated? The answer lay in Cassie's extraordinary preparation and psychological insight. Federal investigators discovered notebooks in her mansion containing detailed research about Carnegie's life, business operations, and social connections. She had spent years studying newspaper articles, business correspondence, and social publications to create comprehensive knowledge about Carnegie's world. More remarkably, investigators found evidence that Cassie had gained access to Carnegie's New York mansion during his European travels, studying his personal correspondence and family documents to acquire authentic details that supported her impersonation. The investigation revealed that Cassie's intimate knowledge of Carnegie family matters came from systematic theft of private information rather than genuine family relationships. Her ability to discuss specific Carnegie business dealings reflected careful research and document theft rather than insider access. But the most devastating discovery was the scope of her document forgery operations. Federal investigators found a complete forgery laboratory in her mansion's basement, including letterhead from Carnegie's office, signature practice sheets, and legal forms designed to replicate authentic Carnegie business documents. The forgery evidence proved that Cassie had created every document supporting her Carnegie inheritance claims. The promissory notes, trust agreements, and legal correspondence that had convinced dozens of banking professionals were all products of systematic criminal fabrication. Herbert Newton received this news while meeting with Wade Park Banking's board of directors to discuss the institution's potential survival. The discovery that every document securing Cassie's loans was fraudulent confirmed the bank's complete insolvency. "Gentlemen," Newton told the assembled directors, "we have been the victims of the most sophisticated criminal deception in American banking history. Our exposure to Mrs. Chadwick's fraudulent operations exceeds our total institutional capital." The board's response was swift and brutal. They demanded Newton's immediate resignation, threatened criminal charges for his role in approving unsecured loans worth millions of dollars, and voted to liquidate the bank's remaining assets to minimize losses to depositors. Wade Park Banking's collapse triggered panic throughout Cleveland's financial community. Depositors rushed to withdraw funds from other institutions that had been associated with Cassie's operations, creating liquidity crises that required emergency intervention from federal authorities. Citizens National Bank faced similar pressures when news broke about their exposure to Cassie's fraudulent debt. Lines of anxious depositors formed outside their main office, demanding immediate withdrawal of funds they feared might be lost to criminal fraud. The bank's president, James Morrison, spent desperate hours on the telephone with federal banking regulators, pleading for emergency assistance to prevent institutional collapse. "We have been defrauded by a criminal mastermind," he argued. "Our professional judgment was systematically deceived by forged documents that appeared entirely legitimate." Federal investigators were unsympathetic to banking executives' claims of victimization. Their investigation revealed that numerous red flags had been ignored or rationalized away by bankers eager to participate in Carnegie family business. These institutions approved loans worth millions of dollars without conducting basic verification of collateral documents, noted U.S. Attorney Francis Baker. Their greed overwhelmed their professional judgment, creating opportunities for criminal exploitation. The federal criticism was particularly stinging because it highlighted systematic weaknesses in American banking that went far beyond Cassie's individual criminal abilities. Her fraud had succeeded partly because banking institutions lacked coordinated verification procedures that could have quickly identified her forged documents. More problematically, the investigation revealed that competitive pressures between banks had actually accelerated Cassie's fraud. Institutions had approved questionable loans partly to prevent competitors from gaining access to supposed Carnegie family business. As details of the fraud emerged, newspaper coverage transformed Cassie from mysterious heiress into criminal mastermind. The same society pages that had celebrated her parties now analyzed her psychological manipulation of Cleveland's elite. Mrs. Chadwick possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit human weakness, wrote the Cleveland Plain Dealer. She understood that wealthy men desperately craved proximity to extreme wealth and used that insight to overcome rational skepticism about her claims. The newspaper analysis was remarkably accurate. Federal investigators documented how Cassie had studied each target's psychological profile, identifying specific insecurities and desires that could be exploited to support her deceptions. Hamilton Greer, the Carnegie banker who had initially endorsed Cassie's claims in New York, found himself facing potential federal charges for vouching for fraudulent documents. His professional reputation, built over decades of careful financial management, was destroyed by his association with Cassie's criminal operations. "I was completely convinced by her sophistication and apparent insider knowledge," Greer explained to federal investigators. "She demonstrated familiarity with Carnegie family matters that seemed impossible to fabricate. How was I to know that her knowledge came from document theft rather than family relationships?" But federal prosecutors were preparing criminal charges that would hold banking executives accountable for their role in enabling Cassie's fraud. They argued that professional bankers should have conducted more thorough verification before approving loans worth millions of dollars. The prosecution strategy reflected federal determination to address systematic banking weaknesses that had allowed Cassie's fraud to expand far beyond what should have been possible. By charging executives who had failed to conduct adequate verification, authorities hoped to prevent similar future frauds. As April 1905 began, the full scope of Cassie's criminal achievement was becoming clear. She had stolen over $20 million from America's banking system, destabilized financial institutions across multiple states, and exposed systematic weaknesses in professional banking that required comprehensive regulatory response. But she had also created human casualties that extended far beyond financial losses. Dr. Chadwick's medical career was destroyed. Herbert Newton faced potential criminal prosecution. Dozens of banking executives confronted professional ruin. Hundreds of bank employees lost their jobs when institutions failed. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated psychology behind Cassie's success. She had understood that American society's obsession with wealth created opportunities for exploitation that went far beyond simple document forgery. Federal investigators noted that Cassie had identified a crucial weakness in Gilded Age American culture. Newly wealthy individuals desperately craved association with established aristocracy like the Carnegie family. She had exploited this psychological need to overcome rational skepticism about her claims. Mrs. Chadwick succeeded because she understood that greed makes people stupid, observed U.S. Attorney Baker. She offered bankers access to the ultimate American fortune, and they abandoned professional judgment to pursue that opportunity. As the investigation concluded, Elizabeth Bigley sat in federal custody, awaiting trial for crimes that could result in decades in prison. Her transformation from farm girl to criminal mastermind was complete, but so was her fall from the heights of American society into the depths of federal prosecution. The woman who had dined with Carnegie associates and commanded respect from banking presidents now faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life behind bars for perpetrating the most audacious fraud in American history. But even facing prosecution, Cassie continued attempting to convince authorities that her Carnegie claims contained elements of truth that would eventually be verified. Her psychological commitment to her criminal identity remained unshaken even as her empire collapsed completely around her. Whether she would be remembered as criminal genius or catastrophic fraud would be determined by a federal jury that would soon decide her fate for crimes that had redefined the possibilities of American financial deception. Chapter 11. Spectacular Downfall. The trial of Elizabeth Cassie Bigley began on October 7, 1905, in the federal courthouse in Cleveland, with Judge Robert Taylor presiding over what newspapers called the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed with banking executives, former social companions, and curious spectators eager to witness the downfall of America's most audacious criminal. Prosecuting attorney Francis Baker opened his case with devastating precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant systematically defrauded American banking institutions of over $20 million, using nothing but forged documents and masterful psychological manipulation. She is not a tragic figure or misunderstood victim. She is a criminal mastermind who identified and exploited weaknesses in our financial system for personal enrichment. Baker's opening statement established the prosecution's strategy. They would prove that Cassie's fraud was not opportunistic crime, but rather systematic criminal enterprise that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of banking psychology and document forgery. The evidence was overwhelming. Federal investigators presented over 300 forged documents bearing fake Carnegie signatures, fabricated legal agreements, and fraudulent correspondence that Cassie had created to support her inheritance claims. Document analysis expert Professor William Hayes testified that all of Carnegie's supposed signatures were created by the same hand using identical writing instruments and techniques. These are not authentic signatures, Hayes explained to the jury. They are sophisticated forgeries created by someone with considerable skill and extensive practice. The forgery evidence was supported by testimony from Carnegie's actual attorneys, who confirmed that none of Cassie's documents matched legitimate Carnegie family legal arrangements. Carnegie himself submitted written testimony denying any relationship with the defendant and denouncing all claims about family financial obligations. But the prosecution's most powerful evidence came from banking executives who testified about their decisions to approve massive loans based on Cassie's fraudulent documentation. Their testimony revealed how systematically she had exploited competitive pressures and psychological weaknesses within the banking community. Herbert Newton, the former Wade Park banking president, whose institution had collapsed due to Cassie's fraud, provided particularly damaging testimony about her psychological manipulation techniques. Mrs. Chadwick possessed an extraordinary ability to make educated men believe what they wanted to believe, Newton testified. She never pressured us for immediate decisions or seemed anxious about potential rejection. Instead, she calmly presented opportunities that seemed too valuable to miss. Newton's testimony illuminated the sophisticated psychology behind Cassie's success. She had understood that aggressive sales tactics would trigger skepticism, while patient confidence would encourage bankers to convince themselves that her opportunities were legitimate. The prosecution also presented evidence about Cassie's actual identity as Elizabeth Bigley, including records of previous criminal convictions for fraud and forgery. This background evidence destroyed any remaining suggestion that her Carnegie deception was an isolated mistake, rather than part of a lifelong criminal pattern. When Cassie's defense attorney, Judge A.S. Worthington, presented her case, he faced nearly impossible circumstances. The evidence of systematic document forgery was irrefutable. Her criminal background was documented extensively, and banking executives had testified convincingly about her fraudulent activities. Worthington's strategy was to argue that Cassie had been driven to desperate measures by social pressures and financial circumstances beyond her control. He portrayed her as a victim of American society's obsession with wealth and status, rather than a calculating criminal mastermind. Elizabeth Bigley was born into poverty in rural Canada, Worthington told the jury. She discovered early that American society judged people primarily on their apparent wealth and social connections rather than their character or abilities. She created the Cassie Chadwick identity to escape circumstances that would have otherwise condemned her to lifelong poverty. The defense argument contained elements of truth about American social dynamics, but it failed to address the scope and sophistication of Cassie's criminal operations. Her fraud had extended far beyond simple identity deception into systematic document forgery and organized financial crime. More problematically, Worthington's strategy required the jury to view $20 million in stolen money as somehow justified by social inequality. Most jurors found this argument unconvincing, especially given the extensive evidence of Cassie's criminal planning and execution. When Cassie herself took the witness stand on October 20th, her testimony provided the most dramatic moments of the trial. She maintained absolute confidence in her Carnegie family claims, insisting that federal prosecutors were making catastrophic mistakes that would eventually be exposed. "I am Andrew Carnegie's daughter," she declared under oath. "The documents that prosecutors call forgeries are legitimate family papers that reflect complex arrangements for protecting Mr. Carnegie's public reputation while providing appropriate support for family members." Her testimony was simultaneously compelling and obviously false. She spoke with complete conviction about family meetings that had never occurred, inheritance arrangements that existed only in her imagination, and business relationships that Carnegie's representatives had already denied. The jury watched with fascination as Cassie maintained her deceptions even while facing potential decades in prison. Her psychological commitment to the Carnegie daughter identity seemed unshakable despite overwhelming evidence that she was actually Elizabeth Bigley, convicted criminal. But her testimony also revealed crucial aspects of her criminal psychology. She seemed genuinely unable to acknowledge that her Carnegie claims were fraudulent, as if she had convinced herself that her elaborate deceptions were somehow legitimate. Prosecuting attorney Baker's cross-examination was devastating. He presented Cassie with specific evidence of document forgery, previous criminal convictions, and contradictions between her various statements about Carnegie family relationships. "Mrs. Bigley," Baker said pointedly, "you have been convicted of fraud before. You have used multiple false identities throughout your criminal career. You have forged documents systematically to support false claims about family wealth. How can this jury believe anything you say about Andrew Carnegie?" Cassie's response revealed both her desperation and her continued faith in psychological manipulation. "Mr. Baker, you are making assumptions about my character based on incomplete information. When the full truth about my family relationships is revealed, you will understand that your prosecution represents a tragic miscarriage of justice." But the full truth had already been revealed through months of federal investigation. Cassie's criminal background was documented extensively, her document forgeries were proven scientifically, and her systematic deception of banking institutions was established beyond reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching unanimous verdicts on all charges: guilty of mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal banking regulations. Judge Taylor's sentencing on November 2, 1905, reflected the unprecedented scope of Cassie's criminal achievement. 10 years in federal prison and substantial financial restitution to defrauded banking institutions. "Mrs. Bigley," Judge Taylor announced, "you have perpetrated the largest financial fraud in American history. Your systematic deception of banking institutions has destabilized financial systems across multiple states and destroyed the careers of numerous innocent individuals." The sentence was remarkably lenient given the scope of her crimes. Federal prosecutors had sought 25 years imprisonment, arguing that Cassie's sophisticated fraud required harsh punishment to deter similar future crimes. But Judge Taylor acknowledged that Cassie's fraud had exposed systematic weaknesses in American banking that required regulatory response rather than purely punitive measures. Her criminal success reflected institutional failures that extended beyond individual criminal behavior. As Cassie was led from the courthouse to begin her federal prison sentence, newspapers across the country analyzed the broader implications of her criminal achievement. The New York Times noted that her fraud had revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in American financial institutions that require immediate attention from banking regulators. The Washington Post observed that Cassie's success demonstrated the extraordinary power of psychological manipulation when applied by someone who understands human nature with scientific precision. But perhaps the most insightful analysis came from the Pittsburgh Press, which noted that Mrs. Chadwick succeeded because she understood that American society's obsession with wealth creates opportunities for exploitation that extend far beyond traditional criminal methods. As 1905 concluded, Elizabeth Bigley was serving a federal prison sentence for crimes that had redefined the possibilities of American financial fraud. She had stolen $20 million from the most sophisticated banking system in the world, using nothing but forged documents and masterful understanding of human psychology. Her criminal empire had collapsed completely, destroying dozens of careers and destabilizing financial institutions across multiple states. But she had also achieved something unprecedented in American criminal history. She had transformed from desperate farm girl into the most successful con artist of her generation. Whether that achievement represented criminal genius or catastrophic moral failure would be debated by historians and criminologists for decades to come. But there was no debate about Cassie's ultimate legacy. She had proven that in America's Gilded Age, The illusion of extreme wealth was almost as powerful as wealth itself, and that sophisticated criminals could exploit that reality for unprecedented personal gain. Chapter 12. Lasting Impact. Elizabeth Bigley died at age 50 on October 10, 1907, in Ohio Penitentiary, having served less than 2 years of her 10-year sentence. The woman who had lived like American royalty and commanded millions in borrowed wealth spent her final days in a prison hospital, suffering from heart disease that had been worsened by the stress of her criminal trial and incarceration. Her death made front-page news across the country, but not because of widespread sympathy for her circumstances. Instead, newspapers used her demise to analyze the lasting damage her fraud had inflicted on American banking and the regulatory changes that her crimes had necessitated. The Cleveland Plain Dealer noted that Mrs. Chadwick's criminal enterprise exposed fundamental weaknesses in American financial institutions that required comprehensive reform to prevent similar future frauds. The scope of that damage was still being calculated 2 years after her arrest. 23 banks had failed completely due to their exposure to her fraudulent debt. 47 additional institutions required federal assistance to remain solvent. Thousands of depositors had lost their savings when banks collapsed under the weight of her unpaid loans. But the financial damage was only part of her legacy. Cassie's fraud had forced fundamental changes in American banking that would influence financial regulation for decades. The Federal Banking Act of 1906 established new requirements for loan documentation that were directly inspired by her document forgery operations. Banks were now required to verify large loan collateral through independent sources rather than relying solely on borrower-provided documentation. The Interstate Financial Crimes Act of 1907 created federal coordination mechanisms that would have made Cassie's multi-state operations much more difficult to sustain. Her ability to exploit isolation between banking markets led to new information-sharing requirements that eliminated the jurisdictional blindness she had exploited. Perhaps most importantly, the Chadwick Protocols became standard banking practice for evaluating claims about family wealth or inheritance. Financial institutions were required to conduct independent verification of any collateral claims exceeding specific threshold amounts. These regulatory changes represented federal acknowledgement that Cassie's fraud had succeeded partly because of systematic institutional weaknesses rather than purely criminal innovation. Her psychological manipulation of banking executives had exposed competitive pressures and verification gaps that required structural reform. Herbert Newton, the former Wade Park banking president, whose career had been destroyed by his association with Cassie's fraud, became an unlikely advocate for banking reform. Speaking before congressional committees investigating financial regulation, he provided detailed analysis of how sophisticated criminals could exploit institutional weaknesses. Mrs. Chadwick understood something about human nature that banking professionals had failed to consider, Newton testified. She recognized that greed and competitive pressure could overcome professional judgment if the potential reward seemed sufficiently attractive. Newton's testimony influenced congressional thinking about banking psychology and the need for regulatory safeguards that could prevent emotional decision-making from overriding prudent risk management. But Cassie's influence extended beyond financial regulation into popular culture and criminal innovation. Her story became the template for confidence crimes that exploited social psychology rather than relying on traditional theft or violence. Law enforcement agencies studied her methods to understand how sophisticated criminals could use identity deception and document forgery to gain access to institutional resources. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, established in 1908, incorporated analysis of her techniques into their training programs for agents investigating financial crimes. Criminal psychology experts were particularly interested in Cassie's ability to maintain elaborate deceptions for extended periods without showing signs of guilt or anxiety that might alert potential victims. Her case became foundational for understanding sociopathic personality traits and their application to organized criminal activity. Dr. Morton Prince of Harvard Medical School published influential research about Cassie's psychological profile, noting that she demonstrated complete separation between her criminal activities and any emotional recognition of their moral implications. Prince's analysis suggested that Cassie's success reflected psychological characteristics that allowed her to view other people as targets for manipulation rather than individuals deserving ethical consideration. This research influenced early developments in criminal psychology and forensic psychiatry. But perhaps Cassie's most significant legacy was her demonstration that American society's obsession with wealth created vulnerabilities that extended far beyond traditional criminal opportunities. Social critics used her case to analyze broader problems with Gilded Age culture, particularly the tendency to judge individuals primarily on their apparent financial success rather than their character or achievements. Mrs. Chadwick succeeded because American society valued the appearance of wealth more than the substance of character, wrote social reformer Jane Addams. Her criminal achievement reflects broader cultural problems that create opportunities for exploitation. This analysis influenced progressive-era reforms that aimed to address inequality and social mobility issues that had contributed to public fascination with extreme wealth. The Carnegie Steel Corporation implemented new security procedures for family-related business after discovering how extensively Cassie had researched Carnegie's personal life and business operations. The case demonstrated that public figures required protection from identity theft and impersonation that went beyond traditional security concerns. Andrew Carnegie himself rarely discussed the fraud publicly, but he did implement changes to his business practices that reflected lessons learned from Cassie's impersonation. His legal team developed new verification procedures for any claims about family relationships or business associations. International observers were particularly interested in Cassie's case as an example of American criminal innovation. European newspapers analyzed her fraud as evidence that American capitalism created unique opportunities for sophisticated financial crime. The London Times noted that Mrs. Chadwick's criminal success reflects the rapid pace of American financial development and the inadequate regulatory framework that has failed to keep pace with economic innovation. This international analysis influenced European financial regulation and contributed to more conservative approaches to banking expansion in countries that had studied American regulatory failures. But perhaps most remarkably, Cassie's fraud continued generating analysis and debate long after her death. Crime historians, sociologists, and financial experts regularly cited her case as an example of how individual criminal innovation could expose systematic institutional weaknesses. The Harvard Business School developed case studies based on her fraud for courses about risk management and competitive decision-making. Students analyzed how banking executives' desire to gain access to Carnegie family business had overcome their professional judgment about loan documentation. Law schools used her case to examine questions about criminal responsibility and institutional accountability. Legal scholars debated whether banking executives who had approved obviously questionable loans should face criminal charges for their role in enabling fraud. 20 years after her death, the National Banking Association published comprehensive analysis of regulatory changes that had been implemented in response to her fraud. The report concluded that the Chadwick case fundamentally altered American financial regulation and established precedents that continue influencing banking security procedures. But the most enduring aspect of Cassie's legacy was her demonstration that in American society, the psychological power of wealth could be exploited by individuals who understood human nature with scientific precision. Her transformation from Elizabeth Bigley, desperate farm girl, into Cassie Chadwick, respected member of Cleveland's elite, proved that social identity was more fluid than most people recognized. Her ability to convince sophisticated professionals that she possessed Carnegie family connections demonstrated that even educated individuals could be manipulated if their psychological vulnerabilities were properly identified and exploited. Modern financial crimes investigators continue studying her techniques for insights into how contemporary criminals might exploit similar psychological weaknesses. Her case remains relevant because the human desires she manipulated, greed, social insecurity, competitive pressure, continue influencing financial decision-making.